All right. All right, we'll wait another minute or so, and then we'll get started as we continue our series. I think this is like, isn't this like our 11th Wednesday doing this? Something like that.
It's all a blur.
Yeah, it is. Has anybody had at least one time in the last couple of months, at least one day where you actually kind of lost track exactly what day it was?
Nearly every Wednesday, I forget it's Wednesday until I forget we have church until you say, like, hopping on
Right.
in 5 minutes. Because it's...
Yeah.
Don't feel bad, Connor. His wife and I sometimes forget.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy. I think there's been two specific times where I kind of was like, wait a minute, what day is it? And it's usually like when I wake up in the morning and then I'm like forgetting what day it is. And I think there was one time that I thought it was like a Monday or Tuesday, but it was actually like Sunday. Like it took me like a few minutes to like go, oh, wait a minute. No, like we have church this morning, which is weird because I should know because I'm getting ready for Sunday school. Like I should have already known. It was weird. So yeah, that stuff happens. All right, guys, we'll go ahead and we'll get started. Just a couple of quick announcements. And the one thing that, as always, I do appreciate you guys logging in. It's good to have you all. I know we definitely would rather meet in person, and I'm looking forward to when we can do that. But for the time being, I do appreciate your faithfulness. Two quick things. Well, really, one of them's quick. The other one might take a minute to kind of go through real quick. Mainly this, there's a few, obviously, graduating seniors. And so because of the way things have been, especially this year with the coronavirus kind of muddling things up a little bit, we're really making a strong emphasis, and this is something we're going to be doing from here on out, a strong emphasis on encouraging our graduating seniors to start at the beginning of the summer to kind of become a part of our group. So that we have at least a few weeks, a few months of being able to really establish a connection with them before, as you know, there's always at least a few of them that go off out of state or out of town for college. And so I don't want to lose them for that summer. And so what we've been trying to do is to connect with them now. And we've been doing that, like Tony Joe's been sending out cards and reaching out to, especially to some of the girls. I've been reaching out to some of the guys. And so if you guys know, and I know some of you probably already know of who some of those seniors are, feel free to reach out to them, let them know we would love to have them as a part of the group. Obviously, don't like pressure them and say, well, like if you don't come, we're gonna, we're gonna punch you in the face or something like that, right? But like make them feel like that we would love to have them because I know that goes a long way for some of them. The other quick thing we'll do, and then we'll dive into our lesson. So if you guys, just in case you all haven't caught on, but I think you have, but it's a good reminder anyway, June 7th, we now have a solid plan that June 7th is the first Sunday that we will begin kind of our slow transition to having a little bit back to normalcy a little bit. So we're going to have two services on Sunday morning, and that's the only... As of right now, that's the only time that the church doors will be open for us to actually have in-person services. Everything on Sunday nights and Wednesday nights will still be online and virtual. Although there might be something, our smaller group as the bridge, we might be able to do something, but I don't want to get ahead of myself. I'll keep you in the loop on something changes there. So only Sunday mornings. There's two services, 9:30 a.m. and 11:15 a.m. The 9:30 service is for people whose last names begin with the letter A all the way through the letter L. And then the 11:15 service is for those people with last names anywhere between M and Z. So if you have any questions you haven't been able to catch on, feel free to ask me later. I'll lay it out for you. And I think actually the Tampa Free Will social media pages line it up pretty easily as well, so you can kind of get what's going on there. The point being is to kind of thin out the crowd a little bit so we're not all right next to each other. We're still some social distancing and try to be safe for a little bit. And for the time being, that's what we'll be doing for, at least a few weeks. Okay, so anyway, with those announcements out of the way, let's dive into our series that we've been doing now. This is our third week, doing One Nation Under God. And I continue to talk about why we're doing this, especially at this time. I thought, well, obviously it's an election year. It's kind of being overshadowed by the coronavirus, but it is an election year. November is when we'll be voting for our president. But not only that, but I think a bigger thing that I'm really beginning to see over the last couple of years is that I think our generation, more than others, probably I see this struggle of how do we balance our faith, how do we look at politics and government through our faith, and so on and so forth. And so if you remember for a couple of weeks ago when we started, we looked at how in order to gain a proper perspective on really the whole world, or really just government and politics, we need to look at the story of the world, right? The whole story. And we looked at how, we see through creation that government and politics was ordained by God as a necessary part of our lives, but that because we are sinful human beings, we can make government and politics not work the way it should. But because of the redemption of Christ, right, there's always that redemptive power at work, and we can use the gospel to kind of redeem our government or our politics, and we can have that confidence to do that because one day God's going to be here to restore everything back to its intended order anyway. And that led into last week where we talked about, because we have that confidence, knowing that God is going to come back to restore this, we also have the confidence then to be able to declare the gospel out in the public square. It's not like it's something that should just belong to us privately inside our homes or inside our worship, our places of worship. We should be able to go out into the streets declaring the truth of the gospel. And so with that, in a way, that spills over into what we're going to talk about tonight, which is the very controversial issue of the relationship between church and state, right? Like this is a very hotly debated topic. And when you think about a lot of the issues that we argue today politically, a lot of them can really kind of come down to that relationship between the church and state. What does the Bible have to say about it? And like, how are we to view that as Christ followers? And I thought about this when it comes to that doctrine of the separation of church and state, especially as Americans, that when we talk about that, I was thinking about when Tony, Joe, and I, in the few months before, I would probably say about 6 months before we actually got married, which was March of 2018, we went through premarital counseling or premarital mentoring, kind of depends on how you describe it. And I would actually advise anybody, whenever you are engaged, go through some type of premarital counseling, because it really does give you a good perspective on what to do in marriage and kind of how to view things and give you that proper perspective. And one of the things that our mentors, that was a really nice couple that mentored us, made us or kind of talk about and taught us to do was, let's say that Tony Joe says something to me and I get a little upset because she said something and she doesn't really necessarily realize she just said something that made me upset, and she realizes, okay, Ace, what's wrong? And I say, well, I didn't like what you just said. And what they taught us to do then is to respond in a way that Tony Joe would respond and say, well, what did you hear me say? Right? And what happens is by her saying that, I can then kind of throw it out there. This is what I think. This is kind of what I heard you say, or what I felt like you were trying to say. And it's kind of out in the open. And what's funny about this discussion, and Tony Joe can say it's happened to her and it's happened to me as well. What often happens is that when we ask the other person, hey, what did you hear me say? And we come out and say, well, I feel like, or I thought I heard you say something like this. It's not usually what the actual person said. So like if I got mad at Tony Joe because she said, don't do this. And I get upset. And she goes, well, what did you hear me say? And I go, well, I heard you say this. And she goes, no, that's not what I was saying. And that's not what I was trying to say. But I took it that way. I mention that because I feel like the debate of separation of church and state, people kind of do that. because they look at, there are just some documents and things from our founding fathers and some influential historical people in the late 1700s, early 1800s that wrote about this relationship of church and state. And it's almost like people will just take a few words or take a few parts of what they wrote and go, this is what they were trying to say. It doesn't, they're not actually interested in what maybe they really are saying. They're just going to take whatever it is and mold it to what they feel like. And so this is why, in a way, as Christians, what I really want to address is not so much what the founding fathers say, the idea of separation of church and state, because we can go through that. And if I'm to be honest with you, I feel like when I've studied it, the emphasis was more on the government not interfering with the church more than the other way around, like some people like to talk about today. But regardless, what does the Bible have to say about the supposed maybe separation or at the very least, what does the Bible have to say about that relationship between the state, between our government, our country, our public life, and the church? What does that relationship look like? And so that is incredibly important for us. And so the Bible doesn't obviously mention specifically how do we in America do it, right? Because America wasn't around when the Bible was written, but it does give some good guidelines that we can use to navigate that very tricky issue of that relationship between state and church. And so if you have your Bibles, we're just going to go to Matthew chapter 3. Go to Matthew chapter 3, and we're going to read the first 3 verses of Matthew 3. So Matthew 3, verse 1 through 3. And what you're going to see is really what this is. This is going to be a jumping off point for what we're going to talk about from here on out as we begin to see that there's actually more teachings in the New Testament about this issue than maybe we first realized. Now, in Matthew 3, this part of Matthew really is documenting the ministry of John the Baptist, right? And if you remember, John the Baptist, he was the one that essentially went out and told people, get yourselves ready because the Messiah is coming. And of course, we know that Jesus basically came right behind John the Baptist, kind of fulfilling what John was preaching. But what John actually does here, John the Baptist, we may not realize this, but actually he made kind of a political statement through his sermons, through his preaching. And we can see it in Matthew chapter 3. Again, we'll read the first 3 verses. Matthew writes this: In those days came John the Baptist, preaching in the wilderness of Judea, and saying, Repent ye, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. For this is he that was spoken of by the prophet Isaiah, saying, The voice of one crying in the wilderness, Prepare ye the way of the Lord, make his path straight. So what Matthew is doing here, and he does this often, is to point to, hey, what we're seeing here is actually a fulfillment of what the prophets prophesied. He's saying, hey, Isaiah actually prophesied about John the Baptist. But here's what's kind of interesting. When John the Baptist says, hey, you need to repent, because he said the kingdom of heaven is at hand. The kingdom of heaven is now coming upon us. And this is why that's important, because John the Baptist knew, you have to remember the culture back in that time, the Jewish people, and John the Baptist knew this, the Jewish people were incredibly frustrated with the political systems that they found themselves in, because, just it seemed like, century after century after century, they were just continuously just being oppressed by other foreign nations or foreign empires that would just come in, take them over, and then tell them what to do, right? And of course, at this time, specifically, it's the Roman Empire that just came in and told them what to do. And I did a little bit of research this week about the taxes that the Romans made the Israelites pay was just absolutely just crazy. Every little thing they did, they had to be taxed for it. And so for them, they very much looked forward to the idea that when the Messiah came, the king of the universe, the ruler of the universe came, he would establish his kingdom right then and there and essentially save them. Now, of course, we know that what Jesus came to do actually was much deeper than just some political, takeover of the Roman Empire or anything like that. But the political aspect of it would be a component of what John the Baptist was preaching and ultimately what Jesus was talking about. Because, again, John the Baptist knew by talking about a new kingdom coming that's a political system. And so he knew that by bringing up the idea that there was going to be a new kingdom, that people were going to portray that politically. Now, here's the thing. Those verses really are just a jumping off point of what we're going to talk about from here on out. And it's just basically to lay the groundwork to say the New Testament actually talks a lot more than we realize about the issue of how to relate the state and the church together. How do we relate our faith out in public? And we're going to look at how the New Testament teaches that through three very influential or important figures that we actually find in the New Testament. Jesus, obviously being the most important, Paul, and Peter. All right, so we're going to look at those guys' teachings a little bit, and I'm not going to make you flip through the Bible. I'll just kind of tell you a little bit about each one, but maybe write some notes down if you want to do more research into this, because there is some teachings for all of them that talk about state, church, and state. So let's first look at Jesus. That's a great way to kind of start. Really, it's hard to picture this idea that Jesus was political in any way, and I think because he intentionally, he didn't pursue like military power. It's not like he had a military with him so he could take everything over with his kingdom. He's not saying, all right, this is my kingdom, let's take over with violence, right? Or he didn't like go in and try to run for office so that he could change the political system that way, or he didn't even try to become a high priest or anything like that, right? Like he was doing this differently. He was launching his kingdom in a way that was political, but it was just a little unusual. And I'll give you an example. When Jesus was arrested in John chapter 18, we read this. So Jesus is arrested right after Judas betrayed him. And so he kind of goes through all these mockeries of trials, but he eventually is found before Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor. And if you remember, they basically say, hey, listen, he said he's king of the Jews, and he's going to throw you guys over, so you better do something about him. And, of course, they're really just looking for an excuse to get rid of him. And so Pilate takes Jesus to the side, and he says, okay, listen, Jesus, I don't seem to see anything that you've done wrong, but let me just ask you, are you the king of the Jews? Do you believe that you are the king of the Jews? And Jesus responds in John 18:36. He said, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then would my servants fight, that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now is my kingdom not from hence. So in other words, he's saying, listen, my kingdom is not of this world. And what we've done is, and I've been guilty of this, but I think especially non-believers can be guilty of this, that they could read this and they can go, okay, so what Jesus is saying is he really doesn't have a kingdom or, something like that, or it's just kind of like an otherworldly thing. It's not something that really belongs here. That's not what Jesus was actually saying. What he's saying is when he says, my kingdom is not of this world, he's saying, my kingdom is not like all the other earthly kingdoms or other earthly empires that you see. My kingdom or my empire is going to operate differently because my kingdom or my empire is of true justice and real peace. In other words, he said it right. If my kingdom was like an earthly kingdom, I would have already had my men or try to bring up a bunch of men and women to take you guys over because that's what typically earthly people do. But that's not what I'm doing. Instead, we're going to break into the political order of the Roman Empire and other governments by simply being good Christ followers. That's really what we begin to see here. So his kingdom is not otherworldly per se. In other words, that it's just out there and it's not here on this earth. Actually, Jesus started his kingdom while here on earth through us by being involved in the political system. Now, probably the more famous political teaching that we can think of when we think of Jesus is the other thing. It's actually found in Mark chapter 12, where the religious leaders go to Jesus, and of course they're going to ask him a question, but they want to trap him is what they want to do, right? And so they say, hey, should we pay taxes to the Romans, right? And so they're kind of hoping if he answers one way, he'll get in trouble with the Jews. If he answers another way, he'll get in trouble with the Romans. And so Jesus, remember, he gets a coin and he goes, well, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, and then render unto God what's God. And people can sometimes think that what he was doing there is he was straddling the fence there, or kind of saying, okay, yeah, there's a public life, a political life, and then there's the church life, and they're separate. No. That's not what Jesus is saying here. And as you begin to think about it, it makes sense, okay? He's essentially saying, okay, like, look at this coin. Okay, fine. It has Caesar's face on it. Okay, you know what? You can give Caesar your money, all right? You can give him that. But then he says, okay, but render unto God's what is God's. Well, what do you have that belongs to God? Think about it. Your souls, right? Your bodies. You belong to God. So in other words, what he's saying is, yeah, you know what? You can give like material things, to the government for taxes and that kind of thing. But don't you ever forget ultimately whose allegiances you should belong to, right? Who you ultimately belong to, which is God. Render unto God what is God's, and that is pretty much your everything, right? And so what we see here is that Jesus is beginning to lay the groundwork that we begin to also see through the teachings of Paul, which is this idea that our allegiances ultimately belong to God, and we are called to simply be good citizens wherever we're at because our allegiance is to God. We honor and glorify him through him. So through being obedient and being good citizens. And so Jesus taught, and his teachings were more political than maybe we realize, and talking about that relationship with church and state. But now let's take a look at Paul, because Paul's teaching, he talked even more about that relationship. And again, we know that he was without a doubt the most influential preacher and missionary back in that day. And so he was at a time where God, I think, really did use him to talk to people who were probably very confused during this time, because they probably were thinking, these Christians were thinking, wait a minute, we were like when you just consider just earth-wise, we belong to a kingdom known as the Roman Empire, but yet we also know that Jesus started his kingdom here. So like, how do we, kind of reconcile these two kingdoms that really kind of seem like they don't go together? How do we say that Jesus is Lord when Caesar says he's Lord, right? And so Paul's teachings really help us with that, especially for us today. How does our allegiance to our country and our government tie into our allegiances to God? How does that work? He wrote to the Philippian church, and if you remember, the Philippians is actually where Paul cites the very famous verse that we know, which is that every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus is Lord. Okay? That verse is very important. We know it, but here's why I think it's important, and it cannot be understated. The city of Philippi, which is where he was writing to, right, was a very patriotic colony to the Roman Empire. A lot of veterans would retire in the city of Philippi. They would go there. It was very much well known as kind of a military city. And I was thinking about it. Actually, the city of Tampa is very much a military city. A lot of veterans live here. We also know that there's MacDill Air Force Base that's in our area. So because of that, we're also a very patriotic city because of our veterans and our roots there. And I thought about this a few years ago. One of the Buccaneers football players, Mike Evans, it was really when the kneeling during the national anthem isn't as big of a deal as it was now as it was back then. And Mike Evans decided to kneel during the national anthem during the home game for the Buccaneers. But of all games, to pick to kneel during the national anthem, he picked the game that happened right before that was the Sunday right before Veterans Day. And Veterans Day, and they had a special Veterans Day like theme at the stadium and all this, and he chose that game of all games to kneel during the national anthem, and he got a lot of criticism for it because, again, of where we live. We're a very patriotic town, and so a lot of people didn't like what he did, and he did actually apologize, and they kind of moved on very quickly. But the reason why I'm mentioning it, I was thinking, in a way, this is what Paul was about to face probably by saying, hey, you know what? Everybody's actually going to confess that Jesus is Lord, not Caesar. He's going to a patriotic group of people, and he's saying, listen, your leader is not God. God is God. Jesus is Lord. And so he was really emphasizing that importance, that ultimately our allegiances lie not with Caesar, but with God. And so we are to proclaim, when we do proclaim that Jesus rose from the dead and that he will come down one day to establish his kingdom here on this earth, if you think about it, there is some political stuff in that, because we know that Jesus is going to establish a whole new government, a whole new kingdom here on this earth, and we can't escape that reality. And so with that, though, again, there's a balance to this, right? And again, Paul does a great job of talking about this. Romans chapter 13, so now he's writing to the church in Rome. He does emphasize to them, he spends one whole chapter, Romans 13, essentially saying, hey, listen, guys, you need to still be good citizens. You still need to subject yourselves to human authority. And he says in Romans 13, verse 1, he said, let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. So he's still saying, listen, your allegiances belong to God. You still need to be good citizens, especially to the good authority that are moral and just, right? You still need to be good citizens here on this earth. You still need to be respectful of your government. And why? Well, because God ordained that, right? We've already talked about that a couple of weeks ago, that God ordained the idea that we should have government and politics. Now, that doesn't mean everybody in politics is good and ordained of God, but that the system itself is a blessing from God. It's something that we are expected to do. But again, the reason why we should, and even Paul says it, the reason why you should be good citizens is because God ordained us to be good citizens. Ultimately, our allegiances belong to him, so we should do exactly what he wants us to do, and that is to be good citizens. And so what we see with Paul's teachings here is that for us as Christians today in the United States, is that, you know what, we should be subject to the governing authorities, right? And because of that, when we do see that our government maybe isn't reflecting what we feel like God would want us to do, well, then it is up to us to use the legal, political, and governmental things that we can use those things that are within our rights to change that, right? And to make it more like what we feel like God would want it to be. And so we see that Jesus' teachings also go along with Paul, with, again, that strong balance of being good citizens, but also ultimately having our allegiances belong to God. And Peter reiterates that. And actually, I'm already running short on time because I could go on and on about this topic. So I'll try to wrap this up quickly. But it's funny because we've been doing our First Peter series on Sunday mornings, and actually what I'm about to cover is what we're going to talk about again on Sunday. And I didn't plan it that way. This is how God worked out, but it was kind of cool. But Peter tells us in 2 Peter verse or 1 Peter chapter 2 verse 9. If you remember, we talked about this last week. He says that we are a separate, holy nation, a peculiar people, a holy nation, a chosen generation, all of that, right? We are set apart because we are God's people, right? We are different, and that is a blessing. And so with that in mind, though, right, because we are God's people, because we are separate from people, Peter then goes on to say, and we're going to cover this on Sunday, that guess what? We have certain responsibilities and duties as God's people. One of the things would simply be, hey, listen, like we have to deny those sinful behaviors and attitudes, right? We may want to do those things, but we can't because we're God's children. But he also says that, hey, listen, that also means you need to be good citizens. You need to submit to human authority and our governing authorities and be good citizens, because ultimately when people see that we are good citizens, we are shining the light back on God. People say, hey, they're good citizens. They're doing exactly what they should be doing and being a part of the political system and trying to better our world through the government, through politics, right? Not just through the church. And so therefore, there's something different about them. And so ultimately, God is glorified through that. And so with all of that, when you look at what Jesus, Paul, and Peter taught, it's so interesting because they lived in a completely different time period, a completely different country, all of that, right, compared to us. But yet their teachings clearly we can apply to our lives today, which would just simply be that we know that Jesus is Lord of everything and that he has already set his kingdom up here on earth, and that ultimately he will finish that one day, right? And so because of that, ultimately our allegiances lie with him, not with any government here, because we know his government is ultimately perfect, not any of our governments. However, we are to live out our Christian lives publicly. And we are to live out our Christian lives publicly by being good citizens, by voting, by being involved, and we can even say that we can be politically active in a Christ-like way, but again, knowing ultimately our allegiances lie with God. And so there's kind of that balance there, and so therefore that allows us to then stand up to when we feel like maybe our government is overstepping its bounds on our religious freedoms and on our religious liberties, because we can say, no, 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 no. Our ultimate job is to spread the gospel. And whenever you step on that right, you step on our duties to spread the gospel, we're going to take a stand against that, right? But then we can also try to make sure that because historically speaking, whenever we see theocracies, right, where a church runs the government, things don't turn out very well there either. And so we have to make sure that there is a balance. And so ultimately, really what I want you guys to walk away from this is really the reason why we are called to be good citizens is really the reason why we're called to do anything in this life according to Scripture, and that's this, so that we can point people back to God, right? When we witness to people, right, it's literally pointing people back to God. When we are maybe not being involved in different things that people from the world would be involved with, it's because people can then say there's something different about that person, and again, God is glorified. And so by being good citizens, right, we are pointing people back to God. God's name is honored and glorified. And so I just highly encourage you guys to not only think about that when you're thinking about the relationship of church and state, right, that balance, but also think about that in every aspect of your life, that you know what, ultimately the reason why we do what we do when we go to work, when we go to school, when we hang out with our friends, right, is that we are honoring and glorifying God. We are pointing people back to Him. So with that being said, I have a few minutes left. Does anybody have any questions or comments to anything that I have said? Hopefully that wasn't too boring for you guys. Hopefully this is something that is feeding you, that is really getting you guys to think critically about our politics, especially as we move forward. So anyway, I really appreciate you guys showing up. Stay tuned for more announcements about maybe us being able to meet in person. We might have a few ideas and a few things that we could do. But as of right now, Sunday mornings, starting June 7th on Sunday mornings, we'll have two services, one at 9:30 and one at 11:15. And depending on what your last name starts with, the first letter is what determines which service that you go to. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions about that. Again, anybody have anything? All right, guys. Love you. You have a good week, and we will stay in touch. See you guys.
Thanks, Ace.
Bye, Ace.
Bye, Leo. Bye, Connor. Actually, Connor might have already hung up. Oh, goodness. Okay.